Last session of the day, we're going to have a roundtable discussion. We have 4 speakers here. Each is going to speak under the heading 5-point plan for Ireland.
I suppose, first of all, I should say a few words by way of context, because there is always a little bit of a danger that when we come in conference and talk about possibilities, that we talk about them more in terms of saying the world would be a better place if it was different, without actually considering what the limitations on the policy space might actually be. In other words, what is possible to achieve. And I mean really here something that I saw in the papers during the week, where Wolfgang Manchu was writing about Germany, and he said there are 2 classes of economists in Germany. There are the ones that have never read Keynes, and there are those that have read Keynes and don't understand him. By which they meant was that, you know, Germany pursues by universal agreement a system of ordoliberalism. And at the moment, because we have, I suppose, what you would call a European Germany in a German Europe, that German influence is extremely strong, and the policy space available for anybody within the system of EMU is extremely limited. The other observation I would make by way of context is that the recovery, which is much celebrated and praised here and in The Economist last week, has really more to do with the performance of the American economy than anything we're doing ourselves, or indeed especially anything to do with Europe. The fact that the American economy has grown by just over 3%, whereas Europe is in a very bad state and quite close to deflation. And the British economy is doing quite well as well. And we're in the middle of this currency triangle, which sometimes acts against our interest, but on this occasion is positive for us. But we could lose the run of ourselves in thinking that, or in believing the propaganda that we are doing extremely well under our own steam, because I think that that's not quite true. The other consideration by way of context is that the world is going through a sort of a paradigm shift at the moment, which involves low growth, high public debt, an aging demographic, and a significant enough challenge to social investment to maintain welfare states. And this is an enduring problem which will confront us more and more in the future. And the other point I would make is that for us here in Ireland especially, this is the 4th occasion since independence that we have confronted serious economic and social challenges. First was in the 30s, then the 1950s, then the 1980s, and today. And it should cause us really, I'd say, to reflect a little bit on whether our political economy model is sustainable or not. Now, if you were to look to general political discourse about the post-crisis environment and future for Ireland, the only significant contributions being made to it that I can see is by the Taoiseach. And he constantly repeats this mantra he has, that Ireland should be the best little country in the world to do business in. In other words, to establish some kind of super competition state here in Ireland, in which basically, by the definition of that term, the interests of big business will always be privileged over the interests of citizens. And I think there has to be more to it than that. We need really a developmental state here in Ireland. And this is what we have to recapture. This is the first of my points. Something that we had for a period achieved in the 1990s, when we had the most sustained and sustainable period of economic and social expansion in our history. But that got lost through the exuberance and foolishness of the following decade. We have to find a way, I think, first of all, to try to recapture that and re-establish that. The second point is that in a book published last year, Donovan and Murphy, looking at the circumstances of the crash here, made the point that a lot of what happened here didn't happen in other small open economies, and that there was good reason to try and emulate some of those countries, really effectively the small open economies of Northern Europe. And actually, we did attempt to do this about 20 years ago when the National Economic and Social Council commissioned a Norwegian academic called Lars Mjøseth to study this question of why Ireland was not doing particularly well at that time and why these other countries had, a much more significant and impressive track record. Unfortunately, however, the sort of takeoff that happened in the 1990s more or less left that question was not pursued. But it is important, I think, because he did highlight a number of important things, a number of vicious circles which had constrained Ireland's development, and other things too, like our inability to establish here a national system of innovation, whereas those countries are extremely good at that. And the fact of the matter is that this is down to our institutions. Institutions do matter, and they are of a sophisticated and long-standing type in many of the Northern European countries. They have a system of trying to agree sort of national approaches, which is based on an ideology of social partnership, a constant sort of engagement of debate and negotiation in the country between the elites and between strong institutions representing all the interests of society. And if you think about it, and has been mentioned already, we have been in recent times confounded by what on the surface should not be really terribly traumatic questions. And Fintan O'Toole wrote in the last couple of weeks about the water situation. It wasn't really that people could be against the idea of establishing a strong water infrastructure, but that they had lost absolute confidence on whether something like that, or the approach to it was right or not, that there was no basis for establishing a consensus, and in his view we were moving further and further towards this stage of the country not being governable at all. And look at some of the other things that we will have to do in the future. Take the transition to a low carbon economy, for instance, and the trade-offs and the choices that would be made in such a transition. You could only possibly do that with some measure of consensus. But if you haven't got the institutions in which to achieve that consensus, well then you don't have much prospect of making it. The third point is that we need to recognize, I think, that the nature of social risk is changing for all countries, but it affects us as well. For instance, in the post-war period, the welfare state that we established was geared towards the idea of a male breadwinner household protecting against unemployment and perhaps child poverty as well. It's a very passive sort of system. But the world as we know it is changing very rapidly, and the nature of social risk is changing. Take the question of the feminization of the workforce and the fact that that involves different social risks emerging for people, particularly in the area, for instance, of caring responsibilities and how we are to provide for that. And in our country, we are extremely weak in that area, particularly the area of childcare. And that imposes, apart from the social dimension to it, quite an economic restraint in terms of being able to get more people back into the workforce in order to establish the tax base necessary to support a strong system of social investment. And this will be, I think, a growing problem in the future from a demographic point of view, because lots of people will be living longer, but they will be living longer in circumstances of chronic illnesses which will require more healthcare expenditure and pensions, which somebody has mentioned, which are very weak at the moment. And you can only support that social structure, if you like, with an effective tax base, which in turn is predicated upon a high level of participation in the labour market with reasonably good jobs, not precarious employment. And you can only have that if you have the infrastructure, the social infrastructure to support it. The fourth point relates to industrial policy. It seems to me really that the game is more or less up on the tax question. The possibility of attracting foreign direct investment with low tax has been the cornerstone of our industrial policy for the guts of 50 years. In fact, it's been impossible really to have any sort of sane debate about that question in the country. But I think really, looking at if you can discern the signs of the times at all, I think that this is something which is not really sustainable. And nor should it be really. This whole idea of tax competition, I think, is extremely damaging. And one of the effects has been to push a lot of the responsibility for tax onto indirect taxes, which by nature are regressive. And so, in effect, a big burden has been imposed on citizens. And if you look at some of the contradiction of policy, I mean, it was quite interesting in the recent budget speech, where Dáil Éireann more or less was clapping for great joy and so on when the minister announced that, limited changes and that we would establish a knowledge development box as sort of the compensation for the changes which the OECD has sort of forced into the corporate tax area. But there is a bit of a contradiction in all of this, in that a lot of the investment, in R&D, that the state finances, actually goes to create profits for companies which they don't want to reinvest. So you have a contradiction that you create the knowledge box idea at the same time, for instance, as the league tables suggest that our universities are seriously challenged in terms of their international standards. And these would be the root, the universities would be the source of contributing hugely to R&D. So there is a lack of coherence, I would say, in this. And the lack of coherence points to the need for a much more active state in terms of industrial policy. We have relied too much simply, I think, on this ability to attract in foreign direct investment and to hope that that will come the linkages which will provide for the development of indigenous industry. But that has not historically happened. It has been one of the great failures of the state. Now, an active state is a different concept. It is not just the idea of the enabling state, of creating simply the conditions for business to thrive and the incentives for them. It is the active leading of development in certain areas. And there were, you can look at some of the work of Mariana Mazzucato, for instance, which will demonstrate clearly where state investment, actually particularly in the United States, has led to huge innovative developments in the area of pharmaceuticals and ICT. And things of that nature. And indeed, even here in the 1990s, it is the active state financing of seed capital and so on, which led to the development of an indigenous software industry. So we have to reorientate our industrial policy, I would think, as a matter of some urgency. The fifth point is that we need to sort out land use and housing policy. We are clearly seeing the development of problems in that area at the moment, and it would be unconscionable, if we reverted to a kind of a development model for housing which was similar to what we have just experienced over the last 20 years or so. And it comes to this point of the nature of land and whether it should be traded as a commodity at all. I mean, there is a point of view held by Carl Polanyi particularly that land is a fictitious commodity. It should not be traded in that way. And in essence, I would say we really need to get to the point of implementing the 1974 Kenny report on land pricing, or at least some modern version of that, which was, a big, I would say, contributory factor to the crisis which you've had. The final point is that we need to be a bit less superficial about our relationship with the European Union. We need to recalibrate that relationship and be a bit more serious about it. In one lesson from the crisis is that it is impossible to really effectively manage a monetary union without a fiscal and political union. And the implications of that are quite serious for us, particularly in the context of a possible Brexit, as they call it, the fact that Britain seems to be heading off in the opposite direction. And while our relationship with Europe was, we were involved with Europe, but not, otherwise deeply committed. It's a little bit like, sometimes I use the analogy of the Great Irish Breakfast. We were like the hen. We were involved in the breakfast. But like for the future, we're quite possibly going to be like the pig. We're going to be deeply committed. So we have to kind of consider what that means. I mean, can we live under German hegemony, for instance? How comfortable will it be with that? Because it's not that's not an anti-German point. The point I'm making is that German ordoliberalism works for Germany because it happens there in the context of a social market economy. But it manifests here as simply a hard-nosed neoliberalism, of the austerity policies which colleague speakers have referred to earlier on. So what do we do? I mean, do we engage with, we continue, seems to me, to engage with this Eurozone construct if it remains for the future? But can we do that as a kind of a lighter version of Britain, you know, Anglo-Saxon type economy? Or do we become ourselves a social market economy like all the other countries in the Eurozone will be? And if we do decide to go down that road, that represents a fairly significant change, I would have thought, in terms of public spending and tax raising policies, a completely different profile than one we have at the moment. And as we see from recent events, adjustments in that area are always going to be quite controversial. And it will require, if we go into that area, broadening of the tax base. And a broadening of the tax base requires in itself, I think, a distributional accord, which is quite different from the sort of laissez-faire type arrangement we have at the moment. And a distributional accord will contribute to better governability, but it will also need the institutions of which I have spoken on my first point, which do not exist at the moment, which, as a matter of fact, have been progressively dismantled over the lifetime of the present government. So it seems to me that at present we are no way fit for the changes which are confronting us. We can deal with them. We will have limited policy space to deal with them, but we do have certain choices to make, and we need to get a discourse about those choices, which I think is why this conference is so welcome.